Have you ever wondered why suspects in crime TV shows always say, "I plead the fifth," and what exactly that means? Today we're delving into the fascinating world of the Fifth Amendment and its role in protecting individuals' rights in the criminal justice system. The protection against self-incrimination that defendants are evoking when they refuse to answer any questions which may serve to incriminate them is found in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. More specifically, the Fifth Amendment provides that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense twice be put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The Fifth Amendment thus contains several important provisions, including the requirement for criminal indictment by a grand jury before prosecution, a prohibition against being tried for the same offense more than once, a provision usually referred to as double jeopardy, protections against self-incrimination we associate with people taking the fifth in criminal cases, protections afforded under the Due Process of Law Clause, and prohibitions against taking private property without just compensation, known as the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Let's explore each of these 5 concepts in turn. In establishing the grand jury system, the founders were drawing on a long tradition in English common law, where the system emerged as a means to involve the community in the administration of justice and to protect individuals from arbitrary accusations by the Crown or governmental authorities. In medieval England, the grand jury system was initially established as a form of local governance. Groups of prominent individuals within a community known as the good and lawful men were assembled to investigate and present accusations of criminal offenses. These early grand juries served as an independent body to assess the credibility of accusations and determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed with trial. Over time, the role of grand juries evolved, particularly in response to concerns about royal power and to protect individuals from arbitrary prosecution. Eventually, the grand jury's primary role was to act as a shield for the community against unwarranted accusations and to ensure that prosecutions were grounded in evidence. The English grand jury system was eventually imported into the colonies. It was incorporated into colonial legal systems, including those in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. With the establishment of the United States, the grand jury system was enshrined in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution as a means of protecting individual rights and ensuring fair and impartial criminal proceedings. Today, grand juries play a significant role in the criminal justice system, primarily in determining whether there's enough evidence to move forward and formally bring charges, a process known as indictment. More broadly, grand juries serve as an investigative body tasked with examining evidence and determining whether there's probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed and that the accused person is responsible. They act as a check on prosecutorial power, conducting an independent review of the evidence presented. Grand jury proceedings are typically conducted in secret, allowing witnesses to testify freely without fear of retaliation or influence. The confidentiality protects the integrity of the process and encourages witnesses to provide candid testimony. Unlike trial juries that determine guilt or innocence, grand juries function independently from the court. They're composed of citizens randomly selected from the community, typically numbering between 16 and 23 members, who serve for a specified period. Grand juries evaluate evidence presented by the prosecutor, including witness testimonies, documents, and other relevant information. The goal is to establish a prima facie case, which means presenting enough evidence to make it probable that a crime has been committed and that the accused person is responsible. After the prosecution's case is presented, the grand jury evaluates the materials presented and decides whether or not there is sufficient probable cause to support an indictment. Remember that probable cause is a reasonable belief that a crime has occurred and that the accused person likely committed it, a lower standard than the beyond reasonable doubt standard used in criminal trials. If the grand jury determines that probable cause exists, they issue an indictment, which is a formal charging document. This initiates formal criminal prosecution processes, and the accused person will subsequently face trial in a court of law. It's important to remember that grand juries are different from trial juries. While trial juries assess guilt or innocence based on the evaluation of all materials presented by both the prosecution and the defense at trial on the basis of a beyond reasonable doubt standard, grand juries hear only evidence presented by the prosecution and base their decisions on reasonable suspicion standards, deciding whether or not an indictment should be issued and the case should proceed to trial. Nevertheless, grand juries are intended to ensure a level of public participation and oversight in the criminal justice process, safeguarding against unwarranted prosecutions and providing a measure of transparency and fairness in the charging decision. The concept of double jeopardy safeguards individuals from being tried twice for the same offense. It's derived from the Fifth Amendment provision that prohibits any person being subject for the same offense to twice be put in jeopardy of life or limb. As we understand it today, double jeopardy has three main elements. First, double jeopardy applies when an individual has been acquitted or convicted of a particular offense and is then subjected to a new prosecution for the same offense. One key factor is that the subsequent prosecution must be for the identical offense involving the same act or conduct. Second, double jeopardy attaches when an individual is put on trial, the trial commences, and the jury is impaneled, or when the court accepts the defendant's guilty plea. Only after jeopardy attaches is the individual protected from further prosecution for the same offense. And double jeopardy protects individuals who have been acquitted or convicted of a particular offense. If a person is acquitted, meaning they are found not guilty, the government cannot retry them for the same offense. Similarly, if a person is convicted and has completed their sentence or punishment, they cannot be retried for that offense. A trial that results in a hung jury or a mistrial generally does not result in jeopardy and is therefore not subject to the double jeopardy restriction. It's also worth noting that double jeopardy applies only to criminal prosecution and does not prevent other forms of legal action or consequences. For instance, civil lawsuits or administrative actions may still be pursued even if the person has been acquitted or convicted of a criminal offense. Finally, the dual sovereignty doctrine permits separate trials at both the state and federal levels without violating double jeopardy provisions. In other words, the state and federal prosecutors could each prosecute the same criminal activity without attaching jeopardy to the other. The Supreme Court has ruled that double jeopardy does not prohibit prosecution by different states, provided there is legal ground to prosecute in both states. Prohibitions against double jeopardy exist to prevent the government from subjecting individuals to the harassment and oppression that can come from multiple prosecutions for the same offense. It ensures that individuals are not subjected to endless trials, protecting them from potential abuses of power by the state. It also promotes finality and certainty in legal proceedings, allowing individuals to move on with their lives after a legal resolution. The right against self-incrimination is also a crucial component of the Fifth Amendment. It grants individuals the right to remain silent and protects them from being compelled to testify or provide evidence that could incriminate themselves in a criminal proceeding. The root of the prohibition against self-incrimination was directly related to the question of torture for extracting confessions. Today, the right against self-incrimination serves several important purposes and carries significant implications for the criminal justice system. First, it recognizes and upholds the principle that individuals should have control over their own personal and private information. It safeguards their autonomy and prevents the government from coercing individuals into testifying against their own interests. It also acts as a safeguard against coerced confessions, ensuring that individuals are not compelled to provide evidence or statements that may be false, misleading, or involuntary. The protection is especially crucial in maintaining the integrity and reliability of the criminal justice system. Protections against self-incrimination help balance the inherent power imbalance between individuals and the government. It ensures that individuals have a fair opportunity to present their defense without being forced to assist in their own prosecution. It recognizes the inherent vulnerability of individuals facing the power and resources of the state. By allowing individuals to remain silent, the right against self-incrimination promotes fairness and accuracy in criminal proceedings. It prevents the use of unreliable or coerced evidence, ensuring that only voluntary and trustworthy information is presented in court. The right against self-incrimination plays a crucial role in protecting innocent individuals from being wrongly accused and convicted. It ensures that individuals do not inadvertently incriminate themselves through statements or testimony that may be misconstrued or used against them. And finally, the right against self-incrimination might even encourage individuals to cooperate with law enforcement voluntarily and provide information when they feel it's in their best interest to do so, while still preserving their right to remain silent and protect themselves against self-incrimination. Because of this, the protection against self-incrimination provided by the Fifth Amendment is a cornerstone of the American legal system. That said, Fifth Amendment protections against self-incrimination have been subject to a variety of legal challenges and have, as a result, evolved substantially over time. Perhaps the most well-known of these was Miranda v. Arizona. In its decision in the Miranda case, the Supreme Court held that individuals must be informed of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, prior to custodial police interrogations. This led to the creation of Miranda warnings, which serve to protect individuals' Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. It's also the basis of key scenes in nearly every police drama show where they arrest a suspect and read them their Miranda rights. In Griffin v. California, the Supreme Court held that prosecutors cannot comment on the defendant's decision to remain silent during trial. This ruling emphasized that the Fifth Amendment prohibits the government from using a defendant's silence against them as evidence of guilt. Burgess v. Thompson addressed the issue of silence during police interrogations. The Supreme Court held that a suspect must explicitly invoke their right to remain silent in order for it to be recognized. Ironically, actually remaining silent without expressly stating the desire to remain silent can be interpreted as a waiver of that right. Salinas v. Texas examined whether a suspect's pre-arrest, pre-Miranda silence could be used against them at trial. The Supreme Court ruled that silence can be used as evidence of guilt if the suspect does not explicitly invoke their right to remain silent. However, if a suspect chooses to remain silent after being properly advised of their rights, the prosecution cannot use that silence as evidence of guilt. And finally, Ohio v. Reiner dealt with the concept of implied waivers of the right against self-incrimination. The Supreme Court held that a defendant can implicitly waive their Fifth Amendment rights by voluntarily answering some questions during police investigations, even if they later decide to remain silent. These cases, along with others, have contributed to the development and interpretation of the right against self-incrimination in U.S. law. They've clarified some of the requirements for invoking and protecting the right to remain silent, prohibited the use of a defendant's silence as evidence of guilt, and established guidelines for Miranda warnings and custodial interrogations. Collectively, these decisions help protect an individual's Fifth Amendment rights and ensure fair treatment in the criminal justice system. The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." This clause serves as a fundamental safeguard against arbitrary government actions and ensures that individuals receive fair treatment and procedural protections. Normally, due process under the Fifth Amendment is divided into two components. Procedural due process refers to the fair and proper administration of the law in the context of legal proceedings, while substantive due process emphasizes the principle that certain fundamental rights are protected from arbitrary government interference, even if the proper procedures are followed. Procedural due process guarantees that individuals are provided notice and opportunity to be heard before being deprived of their life, liberty, and property. This includes the right to a fair and impartial hearing, adequate notice of charges, presentation of evidence and calling of witnesses in your defense, confrontation of accusers, and the right to be assisted by legal counsel. Many of these rights are protected by other parts of the Bill of Rights. Substantive due process, on the other hand, ensures that governmental actions, laws, and regulations do not infringe on an individual's fundamental rights, liberties, or privacy interests without legitimate justification. Substantive due process applies a standard of review to assess the legitimacy of the purpose of the government's actions or laws. Because of their nature, substantive due process rights are less clearly defined and are more likely to be challenged and evolve over time. They are often associated with protections afforded under the 14th Amendment's equal protection guarantees, and we consider the concept of substantive due process in greater detail in our video on the 14th Amendment. Several key Supreme Court decisions have shaped the interpretation and application of procedural due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. In Gideon v. Wainwright, the Supreme Court held that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel in criminal cases is incorporated into the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, thus ensuring that individuals facing criminal charges have the right to legal representation even if they cannot afford an attorney. The Miranda v. Arizona decision, which we've touched on earlier, established the famous Miranda warnings, which inform individuals of their right to remain silent and to have an attorney present during custodial police interrogations. The court held that these warnings are necessary to protect the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In Goldberg v. Kelly, the court addressed the issue of due process protections in the context of government benefit termination, holding that individuals have a right to a pre-termination hearing when facing the loss of important government benefits, such as welfare, in order to ensure fair treatment and an opportunity to present their case. Matthews v. Eldridge established a balancing test to determine what process is considered due process when the government deprives an individual of a significant property interest. This test considers factors such as the private property interest at stake, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the government's interest in efficiency to determine the appropriate level of due process protection. And more recently, in Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, the question of due process rights of U.S. citizens designated as enemy combatants during the War on Terror was addressed. In its decision, the court ruled that U.S. citizens could be detained as enemy combatants, but that they retained their due process rights to challenge the factual basis of their detention before a neutral decision-maker, regardless of that classification. These cases, among others, have shaped the understanding and application of procedural due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. Finally, the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment states, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." This clause incorporates the concept of eminent domain, which grants the government the ability to take private property for public use. However, the Takings Clause imposes limits on this power and ensures that property owners are fairly compensated. Specifically, the Takings Clause requires that the taking of private property be for a public use or public purpose. Public use traditionally refers to projects like building roads, schools, or parks that directly benefit the public. Over time, the interpretation of public use has expanded to include broader community benefits, such as economic development or urban renewal projects. The Takings Clause mandates that when private property is taken, the owner must receive just compensation, which is normally understood as fair market value or the amount that a willing buyer would pay a willing seller in an open market transaction. The compensation is intended to provide the property owner with the fair economic value of the property taken. The Takings Clause serves as a check on government power to take private property by ensuring that the taking is justified and that property owners are adequately compensated. It prevents the government from abusing its authority and helps balance the interests of the public with the rights of private property owners. The court plays a crucial role in interpreting and applying the Takings Clause. They examine whether the government's taking meets the requirements of public use and determine whether the compensation offered is just and fair. The courts also assess the impact of the taking on private property rights and considers factors such as the nature of the property, the purpose of the taking, and the extent of interference with the owner's rights. Overall, the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment limits the government's power to take private property for public use. It ensures that takings are undertaken for legitimate public purposes and that private property owners are fairly compensated. The clause strikes a delicate balance between the interests of the government in pursuing public projects and the right of private property owners, serving as a crucial protection for property rights within the framework of eminent domain. Several significant Supreme Court decisions have shaped the interpretation and application of the Takings Clause under the Fifth Amendment. In Pennsylvania Coal Company v. Mahone, one of the court's earliest decisions on the topic, the Supreme Court established the concept of regulatory takings. In the simplest terms, regulatory takings occur when the government restricts the use, development, or value of private property to such an extent that it's considered a taking. In its Pennsylvania Coal decision, the court ruled that such regulations constituted a taking by the state and was thus subject to the Fifth Amendment requirements for compensation. In Lucas v. South Carolina Coastal Council, the court held that a regulation that completely deprives a property owner of all economically beneficial use of their land is a categorical taking. This occurs when a government policy or action completely devalues a property, most often by reclassifying its zoning or imposing use restrictions. As with regulatory takings, the court ruled that such categorical takings are also subject to Fifth Amendment protections. Finally, the case of Kelo v. City of New London dealt with the issue of eminent domain and public use. The Supreme Court ruled that the government's use of eminent domain for economic development purposes could constitute a public use even if the property taken was transferred to a private entity. This decision was controversial and sparked public debate about the scope of the takings clause. These cases, among others, have played significant roles in shaping the interpretation and application of the takings clause under the Fifth Amendment. They have addressed issues related to regulatory takings, categorical takings, and public use, and the standards for determining when compensation is required. The Supreme Court's decisions have provided guidance on the rights and limitations of the government when it comes to the taking of private property for public use, and have influenced the legal framework surrounding eminent domain and regulatory action. So with that, we conclude our look at the Fifth Amendment. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.